What if I could blend my own tobacco? What if I could make my own tobacco topping? What if what if songs in my head actually played out loud?
Jitterbug. You put the boom boom into my heart. You send my soul sky high.
All kidding aside, today we're going to do a do-it-yourself tobacco topping and a vapor from scratch. Stick around. RoadGlideSully here, checking in from the once independent Lone Star State. So I am smoking some Cornell and Deal exclusive. Probably have never heard of this blend. It's not one of their more popular blends because it's got 50% Perique. You may have heard, I dig Perique. It's actually, vapors are by far my favorite genre of tobacco blend. And for that reason, I've decided to set out to make a unique vapor blend on my own. Well, not entirely on my own. I've solicited some help from a couple of folks to sample the first round that I've already done, and now I'm on to the second round. If you've been paying attention and you're also a subscriber of Four-Eyed Piper, you'll know that he did a first impressions video of the first round of vapor that I did, and I'm calling it Border Crossing, and the reason that I'm calling it Border Crossing is because it's got tequila in it. I've done a couple of other blends, English blends specifically, where I've infused bourbon into the blend, and they turned out pretty good, and I decided, well, why not go with your favorite style? So I've decided to kind of pull back from all of my blending activity and focus on this one blend, Border Crossing, until I get it right. I have in my head a pretty good idea of what I want it to be, and I've explained that to Four-Eyed Piper, Zach, as well. So he did his first impression video kind of in light of what he knew I was after. So I plan on doing a second round of tobacco blending and topping. One of the things you don't see a whole lot on YouTube is information about toppings. So we're kind of winging it a bit. I've done the first round. It didn't turn out the way I wanted to. I used some ingredients that kind of overpowered the final flavor that I was going for. So I went back to the drawing board and I've created another recipe for this blend, which includes a change in both the tobaccos that I'm using as well as the topping ingredients. And so I thought, why not take you guys along for the ride? You may be thinking about making your own blends, or maybe there's a particular kind of flavor that you want to see in a blend and you just can't find it on the market. I used to do that a lot when I brewed beer. I'd make a peanut butter and jelly Kolsch once a year. It was a recipe that I came up with because I couldn't find anything like that on the market. But that's the avenue that we get from a creativity perspective when we try to do things ourselves. So I want to take you guys kind of along for the thought process and the actual process of putting this second round together. It may not hit the mark. I don't know yet. I won't know for several weeks. This whole process is probably going to take about a month from start to finish. And so the process that I'm getting ready to show you here in just a second is the first step in that process. So it's where I'm putting all the ingredients together, and then I'm going to let everything kind of marry and soak, and you'll understand that in a few, for a couple of weeks before I actually do the topping on the blend. I'm going to do two different kinds, and I'll explain that later in the video as well. Two different batches. So I've got about 11 ounces of tobacco that I'm putting together for this round, and if it works out, then I'll see if I can repeat it. If it doesn't work out, then I'll make some small changes. I think this is going to be closer to what I'm trying to achieve at the end of the day, which is a tequila infused Virginia Perique blend. Like I said, I've got a pretty good idea of what it needs to be in my head, and so I've formulated everything together to try to hit that mark, and we'll see. I don't know if I'm going to do it, but I figure why not share this with the YTPC and other pipe smokers that are interested in blending their own tobaccos. It's a little lengthy process, so this video is probably going to be a little long. I apologize, but if you're interested in this kind of thing, stick around. I'm going to explain as much as I can about the process. So I'm going to go ahead and cut to the actual process video, and then once that's over, I'll come back and we'll wrap things up, at least for this first half of the process. All right, first up for this vapor blend that we're going to put together is TS1 Bright Virginia Ribbon. I chose Bright Virginia Ribbon from Sutliff, and the reason I chose it is because it doesn't have any discernible topping to it. It's pretty much a blending Virginia. It's basically bright Virginias. I decided not to get too complex with bright, stoved, that kind of thing, because I really want to accentuate the topping that I'm going to put on this later, and also the infusion that I'm going to do, and I'll explain that in a bit. Getting it out of the bag was a little harder than I anticipated. You'll notice that I'm using 8 ounces of this particular Virginia. I'm going to end up with about 11 ounces total, and that's because I'm also going to use TS20 Louisiana Perique 1.5 ounce bags. I'm going to use 2 of those bags. The reason I'm using 2 of those is because I wanted the ratio of Perique to Virginia to be on the hefty side. This is going to be about just under 30%. You can do the math, but it's going to be pretty close to 30% Perique and 70% Virginia. I just did the math. Well, I did the easy math. You can do the hard math. And yet, like I said, you can see I'm using 2 bags. This is the increments that they sell it in, so I just purchased 2 bags on tobaccopipes.com when I decided to put this blend together. Now, you'll see that this stuff is very dark. It also clumps together quite a bit, which will make it a little bit of a pain to blend together. You kind of have to break it apart. So it's a little bit of a pain to blend because you got to make sure that all those little black speckles, which is the Perique, you got to make sure that that's dispersed as evenly as possible throughout the entire blend. You'll see that I blend this for quite a while. You'll also notice that I'm wearing rubber gloves. Now, the reason I'm wearing rubber gloves is because I wanted to pay particular attention to not introducing any forms of bacteria. These are surgical gloves, and I didn't want to introduce anything that potentially could downstream on the process cause any mold or any funky things to happen with the tobacco blend. I also sanitized the bowl that I'm mixing the tobacco in because I also wanted to make sure that it didn't have an opportunity to introduce any foreign substances into the tobacco as well. So here I'm just kind of showing you how well dispersed the Perique is within the Virginia tobacco. I spent a little bit more time than you saw on camera actually mixing up the tobacco to make sure that the Perique was fairly well distributed throughout the entire blend. Now I'm going to use these little jars. I picked these up at Walmart. You can buy them near the mason jars. But they'll hold a little bit more than 4 ounces of tobacco. If you do the math, it's about 5.5 ounces between the 2 jars. The reason that I'm putting this blend directly into these jars is because I want the tobacco to marry together. To be honest, I don't know if this step in the process is an absolute, but I figured it's probably best to let the tobaccos kind of marry together a little bit before I apply any toppings or try any infusions later on in the process. So now you can see I have the jars pretty well packed with all of the tobacco, and now I'm going to move on to the next step in the process, which is how I'm going to infuse the tequila. I'm going to start off with a ball jar. I'm using Hungarian oak cubes. These are purchased from any homebrew shop. And I'm also going to use Añejo tequila. It's 100% agave tequila. This is actually pretty good tequila. But I'm going to use this to infuse the tequila into the oak chips. Now, I've done the same method with an English tobacco using bourbon, and it worked fairly well. So I'm going to replicate that same process using tequila. So you'll see I pour a pretty hefty amount of tequila in the ball jar. I'm leaving a little bit in the bottle because I'm going to use that later in the process, and I'll explain that in a bit. And I'm going to try not to touch these as much as possible, although they're going to be pretty well sanitized once they get immersed into the tequila. You'll see that I'm going to use quite a few oak chips, and the reason I'm doing that is because I'm going to separate this into two different batches. One, I'm going to just do the infusion, and the other, I'm going to do the infusion and the topping. So I'm going to actually end up with two end products here. Now here I'm just going to use my finger to make sure that all of the oak cubes are submersed, which really is not necessary because you're going to see I'm going to shake this up quite a bit in just a second, because I want to make sure that all of those oak cubes are in contact with as much tequila as possible. These things are going to sit for about 2 weeks inside that jar, and that'll allow for enough time for that tequila to really soak into the oak chips. And, you know, while I'm at it, I said I was going to save a little bit for the topping, but yeah, I'm also going to save a little bit for myself. And of course, whenever you're working with tequila, you got to do a little bit of a, quality control, right? Cheers. So now that we can rest assured that the tequila tastes good, we're going to move on to making the topping. So the first thing I'm going to use is distilled water. I don't want to use regular water because I don't want to introduce any minerals or anything like that. In Texas, we have pretty hard water. So I used 3.5 ounces of distilled water to make this batch. And you'll see what the end result is in terms of volume. But I started off with 3.5 ounces of distilled water. Next up is going to be apple cider vinegar. I chose apple cider vinegar because I wanted a little bit of flavor with the vinegar. Now you remember I also said I was going to save some tequila, and this is why. Not only am I going to infuse the oak chips with the tequila, but I'm also going to add tequila to the topping. I want as much of that tequila flavor in this as I can. You'll see I'm using the same tequila, the Añejo tequila that I used in the oak chips. And finally, to round off the tequila flavor, I'm going to use 100% blue agave nectar. And I'm going to add, you'll see I'll do this twice. This is a game time decision. I decided to add a full tablespoon. I started off with a half a tablespoon, and then I decided to add another half a tablespoon. So it's going to have 1 full tablespoon of agave nectar. So now we're going to fire up the stove, and we are going to heat this stuff up. And the reason we're doing that is for 2 reasons. One is because we want to cook off some of that alcohol that's in the tequila. We don't want to actually dry out the tobacco with the alcohol. And the second reason is because we want to make sure that there is less of a chance of introducing any foreign bacteria into the tobacco blend. So we're going to heat this up to about 175, between 175 and 180 degrees. I'm going to use a thermometer so that I can make sure that I get it at the right temperature. And I'm going to continually stir this as I heat it up. I don't want any of the sugars that were in the agave nectar to scorch or caramelize as part of this process. So typically the sugar is a little bit heavier. It'll sink to the bottom, even if it's in solution. And you have a little bit of a chance of caramelizing that sugar, and I don't want to do that. So I'm going to continually take measurements. Because of the low volume, it's going to heat up pretty quick. It's not going to take long to get it up to 170 degrees. So off camera, I've been stirring this since I started it, and you can see that we're just about to temp. In fact, we are to temp. We're in between 175 degrees and 180 degrees, and the reason we want to do that is it's basically pasteurizing the contents of the liquid. It's killing any bacteria. It doesn't do it instantly, so we're going to have to simmer this for about 10 minutes, at least 10 minutes, to make sure that we've killed any bacteria or any foreign substances. And I'm going to continue to check the temperature as I go through that process. All right, so it's simmered for about 10 minutes, and I was careful to check the temperature to make sure that it stayed over 170 degrees for that full 10 minutes. Now I'm going to go about the process of trying to cool this stuff off. And the key here is to try to cool it off as quickly as possible. And the reason you want to do that is because bacteria loves temperatures right around 95 to 110 degrees. So you want to get through that as fast as you can. So just stirring it wasn't cooling it off fast enough. So I grabbed a bowl, threw some ice in it, and I'm going to set this pan on top of the ice. Now this is a home brewing trick. When you're making wort for beer, you want to do the same thing. You want to cool it off as quickly as possible. So this is a method that you use in home brewing to try to cool off your wort as quickly as possible to get it to pitching temp. And you can see, you can watch this thermometer, and it goes down pretty darn fast once you have it sitting on the ice. It's best to stir it. It'll go down faster if you stir it because you're using thermodynamics. I know that was a big word. Thermodynamics to cool off that liquid as fast as you possibly can. I want to get it down to about 90 degrees by the time I'm done. And that's a fairly safe temperature. I'm going to put it straight into these sanitized bottles when I'm done. So I got it just under 90 degrees, right about 86. And so I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Okay, the last step in the process is to put the mixture into these spray bottles. I actually purchased these bottles off Amazon. I've sanitized them. I actually have Star San, which is a sanitizer that a lot of home brewers use. So I've sanitized these bottles to make sure that they're as sanitary as possible. Again, through this whole process, I don't want to risk adding any additional bacteria. You'll see a normal funnel is not the right size. It won't fit in these bottles because they're fairly small. But I've got a solution for that. And that solution is a whiskey funnel. This is the funnel that I use to fill up a flask. It fits nicely inside these bottles as well as a flask. And so you'll see that I'm going to just basically pour this mixture into the bottles. And I had 4 bottles ready because I wasn't entirely sure how much volume I was going to lose through the cooking process. I knew I was going to lose the alcohol, or most of the alcohol over that 10-minute period, but I wasn't sure how much of the overall volume I was going to lose. So I had 4 ready. I would recommend you do the same, just in case you don't boil off as much as you thought you were going to. It turns out I ended up with 2 full bottles, and that should be plenty to do what I'm going to do. I probably won't even use more than one of them. So that's it. Pretty straightforward process. The reason it's going to take almost a month is because for a couple of weeks, I'm going to let that tobacco kind of marry together in those jars. And I also need to let the oak chips soak for a couple of weeks because I want that tequila to get as deep into that oak chip as I can. Because that's really what's going to impart, I think, a lot of the flavor, or at least that's been my experience with a couple of English blends that I've infused bourbon into. So this process will take a couple of weeks to let those things soak. Then I'll apply the topping. I'll record that and do a video of that as well. And then I'll let it sit for another couple of weeks. And then if I can, I'll talk Four-Eyed Piper, Zach, into doing another first impression video. And hopefully he'll be okay with doing that. I mean, it's free tobacco, which, by the way, if you want to try this process and you need somebody to do a first impression or just let you know what they think of the results, I'm happy to do that. I mean, if you want to send me free tobacco, feel free. So once this is all done, I'll put together a playlist. But for now, that tobacco's just sitting in there, marrying together. And we'll see what it's like in a couple of weeks. I'll probably pull a bowl or 2 of just the plain Virginia Perique off, maybe a couple of ounces off, just so that I'll have that true control of just what the tobacco tastes. So I'll be able to compare kind of a 3-way comparison. I'll be able to taste just the tobacco, the Virginia and the Perique together. I'll be able to sample the topped version. We'll also have the oak cubes, and then I'll also be able to compare the one that just has the oak cubes to see which one I like better of the 2 processed tobaccos. So until then, I'm RoadGlideSully. Keep the rubber side down.